into a Christian secular continuum. Now, I'm going to end with this. This would be segment 3, and I don't have time to go into this, but this is where I've been working. So this particular strand here is Sikh concepts that I've been working with. So the word Sikhi, Gurmat, Anhaj Shabad, Nirgun Sargun, Akal Purkh, and Hukam. They're very key central concepts in the Sikh lexicon. The central section here shows what would be the uncensored identifications during the colonial period. This is what translatology actually does to these terms. So it translates Sikhi, for example, as Sikhism or Sikh religion, Gurmat as belief or doctrine, and this very important term, Akal, as immortal being, Akal Purkh as a personal God, and then this term Hukam, which is derived from Arabic and also from Persian, which means God's command or order. Now, it's not just the case that they can be translated differently, but we need to look a lot deeper than just translating them slightly differently, and this is what I've been trying to sort of work out. So if these are the uncensored identifications, what the translatology allows, I've been trying to work with what might be the censored identification to try and pull out what might be a non-colonial translation of these terms. And where I'm sort of pushing at the moment is to work with different frames of time, so that the history of colonial translations, this particular central strand, all are produced within a particular time image and a particular image of thought, which is chronological. It works in historical time. All of these concepts, however, actually work in a different frame of time. We can call that aeon, for example, and the best word for it is actually akal, which has been very badly translated simply as immortal, or the immortal being. But it's actually best translated not as non-time, but as untimely. So it can still be untimely being or whatever, but the question is the notion of the untimely here. And this is produced in a kind of affective encounter, a non-comparative affective encounter. And so I just played about with different meanings that can be produced here. So Sikhi really should be a path of learning. It should be a temporal path of continuing to learn until, from the moment that one is born to the time that one dies. And then working through these other terms as well. And the word hukam, for example, doesn't have to be translated as God's command or God's order. It actually works much better simply as a force or an impersonal force. There's a lot going on behind there, and I don't think I have time to get into it, but I hope that gives you an idea of where I'm going with this. So I'm going to leave it there. I'm out of time, right?
Yeah, I think we should be
fine.
for discussion. Thank you, Arvind.
Sikhism up there as a Sikh concept. Was that a conscious decision? And so could you explain how it might be uncensored? How you might use the censor.
Well, I'll give you a good example. So I was writing this book, Sikhism, A Guide for the Perplexed, and I asked the publisher, can I put a hyphen or something to indicate that actually the real term is Sikhi rather than Sikhism, which is a much later adoption. And they said, no, we can't do that. So that is one example, but no, I'm conscious of it. And I use them interchangeably because it has become a term that everybody uses. You can't refer to Sikhs without this term Sikhism. But at the same time, you kind of have to break that history as well.
But is it a precise demonstration of the point you're making about what's the term, sorry, about the translatology, about the mechanics of translation, the signals that would be produced through that process?
Right.
So
Yes.
what do we do with it as a term in rethinking the practice of translation? Do we have to just ditch Sikhism altogether, or can we rethink what it actually means?
Simplest answer, and what I do is simply complicate the two terms, use them interchangeably. I think the most difficult cases arise in sort of legal cases that I've come across. But at the ordinary grassroots level, at the level of lived experience, they can be easily used interchangeably. But there is greater consciousness now in this generation that the real word is Sikhi. It designates something quite different. But other than that, I'm not sure, to be honest.
So I'm really able to reflect on what you're doing here, because it seems to me that it provides some kind of an answer to all the historical models that you pointed out. If what is happening here is some kind of, I would say, kind of a meta-commentary or a meta-theoretical reconsideration of the terms in the central column, and in which case, could one say that the kind of cut or notch that you're trying to make is, it raises the question of where that is happening, because in some sense, the middle column is now steeped in the vocabulary of cultural difference, is to say that there's Sikhism as opposed to Christianism. In the way you translate. The transitions seem to be happening at the level of the concept, in some sense.
No, that's exactly where it's happening.
Yeah. So in some sense, it raises the question of priority. Which is anterior, which is posterior, in the sense that the cut that you're trying to make will have to be retroactively projected backwards.
Right. That's a great question, actually, because the third column could easily also be read as what was happening in the pre-modern period, right? So it's precisely what was censored in that time. But what I'm doing, and I have no interest in privileging the pre-modern sort of period. I've kind of been through that, and people say, well, this is great, we can resurrect what's going on, and I'm not interested in resurrecting anything, because the situation in which where we're situated now in terms of thought is different from where it was 100, 200 years ago. What I'm doing here is simply playing with my own unconscious, okay? My own, if you like, diasporic unconscious, which is that translation happens naturally as an encounter between two concepts. They do not encounter in a conventional sense. They're both my concepts. So English is mine. It is. It's as sacred to me as the Punjabi is. The two work together. If that's the case, what comes out of that, and what kind of translation? If we can even use the word translation, because I was playing with the term "the end of translation" here, but it's not the end of translation. It's simply a new image of translation that doesn't work according to the representative regime. Does that answer your question or not?
I very much appreciate your elaboration on translatology and how the colonial discourse seep in there through schooling and all. I wonder whether you have any explanation or any idea of why this colonial discourse about translating one into the other seemed to be so attractive that it became the prominent discourse. I mean, could that have been that it would not click with anybody? So do you explain it just by power relations or
I don't think it's just due to power relations. It's not as simple as that. I think the simple answer is that English becomes currency. Anglophone concepts and English language becomes currency. So there is kind of a, if you like, for native elites educated at a time, and especially today, I would say, a kind of libidinal attachment to English, because English, it's perceived as not doing anything, it's not producing any resistance, but it gets us straight to where we are. So there is this kind of attachment, and to me it is literally like a libidinal attachment to the currency of Englishness and English language. Partly because of its dominance, of course, but partly because even scholars who have tried to resurrect the Punjabi language in its purest form in the last 30 or 40 years in Punjab, they find it impossible to work in a Punjabi world. It doesn't exist anymore. You have to mediate via English, which means you have to reference this world that we all share in making meaning at some stage. So it's not a case of why the native elites would be attracted. I think it's just this natural attachment to that. And to be honest, I'm not outside of that myself. But all I'm doing is turning around the terms and trying to create a kind of decathexis, if you like, decathecting from that libidinal attachment and trying to do something like I'm doing in the third column here.
So when you talk about translatability, you use Steiner's point of view in conjunction with Wilfred Smith and Jonathan Smith in religious studies. But in my understanding, they are just adopting a different approach. You understand the issue. Their use of universality is not necessarily coupled with a colonial understanding. They are just trying to put it in a different way of arguing about how things can become translatable and transformable. So can you say a bit more?
Right.
Yes.
Firstly, I think the way that Benjamin handles translatability is more complex than that. Translatability, he works on two levels. There is language and there is pure language, right? And that pure language resists unhindered translatability. Okay, I don't think it's the same as the kind of translatability that I've been talking about, which is currency. I think Benjamin is deeply resistant to that, and you can actually hear a lot of Benjamin in what I'm saying as well. So I think he has to be read a little bit more carefully than that. And yes, I'm completely aware that, for example, let's say in the Sikh context, the scholars were trying to create new universals, but out of their own linguistic concepts. But the problem is how to do that when the machinery that you're using is replicating Christian secularism, basically. Okay, and that's where I come in with this term political theology, because the comparative context, the encounter between contexts, I think if that problem can be worked on and solved, it will give us an insight into the wider clash of civilizations and stuff like that. We're kind of working backwards, I think, on that particular issue.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you about regime
Sorry, Ken, I was looking elsewhere.
Regime of representation and notions of gender and work of gender on those conceptions, both in the way that it complicates that, but also suggests a certain gender representation. And particularly looking at some of the words you have here, how do you think gender works in both that uncensored identification and that unconscious playing with censorship?
Very simply that this particular god that was produced was a male god, and I think all gender allusions to femininity, etc., were kind of excluded in these commentaries. So I think I know of one or two scholars, Nikki Singh, for example, is one who's reworking these translations in terms of gender, but bringing back the kind of feminine influence. But I'm also a little wary of that as well. I did think you have to be a little bit more careful. That's a very short answer. But there is a much larger one that I'd like to. Well, I shouldn't go there because it'll just open up a whole can of worms. But where I'm going with this is to talk in the 6 scriptures. The name of God is attached to something called killing Homer, or self-sacrifice, ego loss, if you like. And that ego loss is essentially the killing of what we would regard as a normative male ego. So that opens up the door to something completely different in terms of gender. Like I said, that's a huge thing that I'll just give you a glimpse into what's going on there. But it's I have played around with it using kind of Lacanian ideas and then using the Sikh stuff to critique Lacanian psychoanalysis, which for me represents precisely the problem that's going on in the third thing here, the third column here. Sorry, the second column, not the third column. Yeah.
This is rather a commentary, I think, unless you have an answer to my question. I am the absolute minority here doing Latin America. Sort of one person. Thank you very much for having me. The Spanish and Portuguese empires started translating and codifying indigenous languages 200 years before the British Empire ever did. Do we know anything about any kind of relation, anything, ignorance or knowledge and not taking it up, of British missionaries, of what the Catholic missionaries have done before? Or is it time that we should look at some kind of taking it out and knowing about it? So I get the impression here that just now that we're working 2 universes versus things which are very, very similar.
Right.
So
short answer is that there was a definite discourse of influenced by Catholicism, Catholic missionaries in India prior to the coming of the British. It's well known. They worked under a very different paradigm, and it's one of the reasons why deism was really, I think, regarded as a kind of an enemy to be defeated, and why we had Anglicanism coming in. It was partly seen as mollycoddling the Catholic understanding of these indigenous cultures. That's a very short answer. Does that help at all?
Yeah, no, it's not about help. I think it's just thinking that there are, both missionary efforts,
right,
and as scholars we haven't really interacted on this.
Right.
So
when
the Jesuits went to India, obviously.
When the Sikhs, when the British are talking about the Sikhs, for example, their descriptions of Hindus is entirely in terms of Catholicism, right? Whereas they talk about Sikhs as like the Protestants, basically. So they are very aware that there is a missionary discourse which has put indigenous cultures in a very benign kind of light. So yes.
Last question.
Okay, so back to the columns. So the first column, my first question is, would it be okay for me to replace Sikh with Punjabi there? And if not, why couldn't I make, because they're all Punjabi words. So,
Right.
You know, would we be able to do the same thing, or what difference would it make? And then it's just sort of building also a little bit on what William was opposing to. Could you tell us just a little bit more about the machinery, use the word that you just then, for producing the sense of identifications? Like, is there an actual machinery, or is it a little bit kind of random? So, if you like, yesterday we saw Sarah produce a kind of different kind of machinery of
Right.
translation with her maps, 4-layer maps. So, are you doing something systematic?
I'm going to answer that question first. Yes, I am. That's the whole project of the new book.
Yeah.
But the machinery, the actual mechanics of how it works, and it's not really mechanics. It's all affect. This whole column works on affect. It can't work in any other way. It cannot work through rationalization. The second column is pure rationalization. So what's happening, let's say, in my consciousness, in this encounter between an English concept and a Punjabi concept, it only works by affect. So in my consciousness, they come together, they produce something which is not allowed to be reproduced in the public domain. Okay, it's automatically censored. So the only way I found to work with this is to, in my next book, is to reproduce that partly through autobiography and partly through memorialization of instances where these concepts come up. So I'm having to delve into a, what can I say? It's really a wishy-washy kind of domain, but I have no way to do that. I'm delving into the domain of comparative literature in a sense.
But it all seemed very reasonable.
And then the first question you asked. The first question you asked was, can I replace Sikh with Punjabi? What did you mean by that?
I just meant, when we're thinking about those concepts they're all Punjabi concepts.
Right.
So Roger Ballard produced that
Yeah.
piece about
Right.
rethinking religion, where instead of having religion, you had 4 Punjabi
Right.
terms to explain different kind of concepts that kind of make up for him.
Right.
It's something that I keep to my eyes.
Yeah, I know what Roger's getting at, but he's echoing a kind of left-wing romantic notion of Punjabi, which was actually produced in the late colonial period itself. And I'm not sure I want to go there. These terms actually, the word Punjab and Punjabi, Nanak never uses them, for example. The Bhakti poets and stuff none of them refer to a particular region as such or any identification with a region. I would say that no, they're not. You cannot replace it with Punjabi. You can replace it with another concept, which I would call diaspora, which means, and diaspora here is not the spreading out spatially from one region to another, with a homeland and you're going beyond that. It's basically the intrinsic the internal, an internal explosion, if you like. In the sense that one is, it's eccentricity. So Nanak has no region as such. I know where I'm going with this, but my thought process is all over the place. The way I use diaspora is intrinsically temporal. It is not spatial. And so it's better, these terms I would say, are diasporic. They don't have a center to which they stick. They can mean something in different places, and Nanak himself and all of the gurus were deeply diasporic. They never stuck to a particular language or a particular region.
You giving them a centre by saying that they're Sikh concepts.
Right, but the moment you use Punjab, you put it into a particular region. I'm exactly against that, and Roger does not understand that at all. To him, it's this romanticised notion. So, sorry about that.
Okay, I think we're all done and ready for lunch. So, thank you very much, Arvind. That was a rich paper and a discussion.
Thank you so much.
And we will carry on.